The university is no longer just in crisis, it's actively collapsing. Skole IRL is a podcast dedicated to understanding the worlds people are building in its ruins already today. Each week, we explore the emerging experimental sphere of para-academia, with thinkers and builders doing the work to create spaces for communal study and knowledge-making alongside and outside the conventional university ecosystem. I'm your host, Sarah Begovac.
And I'm your co-host, Ira Allen. Together, we're learning each week how to salvage Skole from institutional hoarding and collapse alike.
Join us in reclaiming time and space for something like leisurely thinking outside instrumental ends. Skole in real life. Welcome everyone to Skole IRL. This week we are joined with Mason Herson-Horvath from the Institute for Social Ecology, an independent institution of higher education dedicated to the study of social ecology, an interdisciplinary field drawing on philosophy, political and social theory, anthropology, history, economics, the natural sciences, and feminism. The ISE has offered intensive summer programs, a year-round BA degree program, workshops on issues such as biotechnology and global justice, fall and winter lecture series, internship opportunities, an expanding catalog of online courses, and a speakers bureau. In addition, the ISE is involved in research as well as publishing and activist projects. As an educational and activist organization, the ISE is committed to the social and ecological transformation of society. Established in 1974 by Murray Bookchin and Dan Chodorkoff, it is the ISE's core belief that the human potential to play a creative role in natural and social evolution can be realized, thereby allowing us to foster communities free from hierarchy, social inequity, and ecological degradation. The ISE views the global penetration of systems of domination into daily life, the centralization of political and economic power, the homogenization of culture, and the strengthening of hierarchy and social control as impediments to human freedom and the root causes of the current ecological crisis. The ISE has been a pioneer in the exploration of alternative technologies and ecological means of food production, like organic gardening and permaculture. Studies at the ISE have combined theoretical and experiential learning in community organizing, political action, ecological economics, and sustainable building and land use. Over its history, the ISE has strived to be an agent of social transformation, demonstrating the skills, ideas, and relationships that can nurture vibrant, self-governed ecological communities. Mason Herson-Horvath is the program director of the Institute for Social Ecology. He is an organizer, writer, communal gardener, and neighborhood democracy militant. His other work, previously under the name of Mason Herson-Horde, has been published in Roar Magazine, The Next System Project, In These Times, The Ecologist, Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, Socialist Forum, and Harbinger, a journal of social ecology. He is currently finishing a book on Marxism and direct democracy and building a commune in Bellingham, Washington. Let's get it started here with the Institute for Social Ecology. Hey, Mason, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's just jump right in. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the Institute for Social Ecology? How did it come into being? And what conditions would you say, either structural, social, or personal, are making it both possible and necessary?
The ISE is a radical popular education organization that's been doing education programming for left-wing grassroots social movements for over 50 years. It was founded in 1974 by Murray Bookchin and Dan Chodorkoff, and for much of its history been rooted in a home base in central Vermont. The ISE is created to deepen thinking and understanding in the radical left about the relationship between our ecological crisis and structures of social inequality and domination. So the ideas of social ecology, in essence, come down to the position that our ecological crisis is a social crisis, and that overcoming problems such as climate change and the biodiversity crisis is only going to be possible through a sweeping social revolution that sweeps aside hierarchical forms of society in favor of direct democracy, a society beyond capitalism. Yeah. The Institute came into being in the early 70s as part of the broader countercultural fervor of the time. It's a kind of a mix between or cross-pollination from the commune movement that was underway all across the country, and also disaffection from some of the left currents that become dominant in the radical movements in the United States. In a lot of ways, social ecology is immersed out of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism, but is a reaction against some of the problems and the sort of like conditions that have shaped where it came from. I think it was motivated to be a space for deeper, longer-term reflection for our movements that is outside of and beyond the ebbs and flows or the cycles of street activity in the wider struggle. I think it's notable that the ISE came together kind of at the very end of the last crest of revolutionary movement activity in this country in the early 1970s, and for the bulk of its history has actually been trying to keep that flame alive through a period of protracted reaction, consolidation of neoliberalism and conservative politics in this country. And that has played really important roles in the resurrection of radical politics of the 1990s and then again in 2011 with Occupy Wall Street, the revolution in Rojava. As far as necessity, I think spaces like this will always be necessary, at least so far as we remain in a capitalist state-dominated world where the people in our movements are recognizing the limitations of our approaches and have need of space to pause, think, reassess, and reshape our thinking and dialogue with other people across different struggles. I think that feels more necessary now to me than ever, but I'm sure it has been throughout the organization's history too.
Well, can I just follow up really quickly on that? How did you get involved? What made this the place that you're sort of putting your leadership talents and energy into? There's lots of good things happening, but what made ISE the thing for you?
My background is as a community organizer, and that's what I did professionally for a number of years after leaving school. My first contact with the Institute for Social Ecology was in 2017. I and a group of a couple other comrades co-authored a piece that won an essay contest by the Next Systems Project, and that was heavily inspired by some of the ideas of social ecology. And so that put us in touch with them, and we're invited to come attend a week-long summer intensive program that the IC was putting on in San Francisco that year. I was also, like, in that period, reassessing my own role in the movement and then coming to the conclusion that, well, I think the sort of base building work of community organizing needed to be much more front and center in radical politics than it has been for most of the time that I've been active. I also was coming to realize that's not actually my primary strength, and most of the roles that I was settling into with the most confidence and capabilities in movement organizations was in a political educational dimension. And that's part of what attracted me to the IC, and then kind of like prioritizing my own role in the movement under that umbrella. The other thing for me personally was that I had always imagined I would go back to grad school someday. I only have a 4-year undergrad degree, but because the kind of movement work that I was doing was so rooted in a particular place that it felt kind of insane or untenable to me to set that all aside in order to go pursue higher education. And I think it was also becoming more apparent the extent to which there's a nationwide institutional crisis in higher learning that makes it a pretty unviable as a career track, particularly for those of us more in the social sciences realm. And so I needed a political or intellectual home to help shape me so that my ongoing education was not pure autodidacticism, but the the ability to have that in a setting that whose commonality is revolutionary politics, and that doesn't require wading into the institutional morass of academia was really attractive, and a big part of why I've stuck around. It's felt really important for my own development the past 9 years, 8 years.
I appreciate you sharing that, 'cause I think the future of higher education is becoming increasingly inaccessible, and navigating that is, and finding senses of home within that, I think is really important right now for people trying to find a sense of belonging and being for collective thinking and learning together outside of those systems that are established. I'm curious, what would you say are the main challenges facing established systems of education, in your words, that this space is responding to?
Well, I think there's two primary threats that I see to institutions of liberal arts education and university institutions. One that is on a long-term scale, the past several decades, deepening, and the other that is more related to the particular moment that we're in. But I think universities have faced many of the same disciplining forces of neoliberalism as others in public life. And there has been a long-term initiative by forces on the right to retool the university into a center of profit making, or if it cannot be profitable in itself, something that exists solely to serve capital accumulation outside. And the kinds of fields that do not have the most immediate or obvious relevance to that project have been steadily undermined through war of attrition that's happening on many different fronts. And I think this is mangled together with the kind of employment crisis in academia, where the functioning of universities requires a steady supply of exploitable labor in the form of grad students who do most of the actual work of operating many universities and institutions. And historically, that has been maintained through this kind of social contract that if you go through this to sustain the institutions, one of them is going to have a place for you in, as a history professor or whatever else. And with the attacks on university budgets, whittling them down over the years, that has become not possible for the vast majority of people who go through those kinds of PhD programs. I also think that in addition to this, or maybe it's like a climax of this longer term neoliberal assault on the university, they have been identified front and center as a political target of the current right, and used as a setting for wielding the power of the state to impose a particular social agenda. And the ones that resist face serious punishment, and the ones that don't are, I suppose, punished in their own ways and being hollowed out as institutions of any kind of intellectual integrity. Thinking of like the case this year of the TA, the University of Oklahoma, who gave a student a 0 for a non-submission that called trans people demons and was not even a meaningful response to the prompts, and expelled her from employment. And these kinds of, I think these two sources of threat to universities are related because in a sense, because both of them entail a kind of unprincipled or like an internalization of the lack of principle by their own administrations, who've been prepared over the past decades to sell their own students and faculty down the line if the incentives are right. And I think the current administration is seizing upon that in some really damaging ways. And this is also relates to kind of the role of the student movement too, where university administrations see themselves as keepers of order who are doing their job means disciplining student movements, cracking down as forcefully as possible on those demanding justice for Palestinians or trans people or anything else that is the target of the day by those in power.
Now, has all this? I largely agree, as you're not surprised to hear with your analysis there. But has all this in your experience, prompted more people to turn to Institute for Social Ecology? Have you seen, like, you're one of the longest standing institutions, sort of para-academic institutions in the country, in the United States, as you mentioned, founded in the Bookchin era, which is one of the funny things for everyone who doesn't know anything about anarchism, as they think about anarchism as, oh, no, it's like Outback Steakhouse anarchism, no rules, just right. Rather than, in fact, very interested in creating durable, sustainable structures that allow for flourishing. But so have you seen, as the capacity for flourishing in some of the established structures has waned, has that driven more engagement with ISE? Or is there a sort of profusion of other similar institutions, all, I want to use the word market share, but like all kind of competing a little bit for attention? What does that look like for you? What's that ecosystem of para-academic space today?
That's a good question. My instinct says yes, but I can't. It's hard to piece out the relationship between these kinds of troubles in mainstream academia from growth in the ISC, because we have so strongly tracked with other kinds of developments in movement realm. So like there was, well before my time, there was a period of serious decline in the ISE's programming and such, where there was the serious crackdown after 9/11 on the anarchist left and the ultra-globalization movement in general that had kind of been the main movement scene that the ISE was involved in at the time. And then when Murray Bookchin died in 2006, the ISE also lost its land base. And so from 2006 to say 2014, 2015 was kind of what we refer to as the dead times or the down times, where very little activity was happening. But the events that actually dramatically re-energized the ISC as a educational space for folks in the movement was the revolution in Rojava that started in 2012. Results of the Syrian civil war and the state having to withdraw its forces from the Kurdish majority regions in northern Syria. For those who aren't familiar, the Kurdish movement under the leadership of the Kurdistan Workers' Party since the early 2000s had been operating with an ideological program that is largely drawn from, inspired by the ideas of social ecology. And so when this happened in the early 2010s, they had this extraordinary opportunity to put much of these politics of women's autonomy, direct democracy, etc., into immediate practice, as well as this impending existential threat from ISIS should they fail to actually take power in this way. And that had a really substantial effect on the ISE's growth and development. So I know of individual people who are in this space because grad school is not working for them, but I think it's hard to draw clear big picture trends. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that there's a lot of people in our programming who have a foot in both, who are like in master's and PhD programs, but are part of the ISE community because that's the space for them to deploy their intellectual production in a politically active way that's in a way that's kind of disincentivized in their university context. So they're not necessarily a zero-sum game. And there are also people who've first gotten their feet in the water of kind of developing themselves as movement intellectuals in our space, who then go on to conclude, okay, now it's time for me to go do a PhD program or something.
Can you say more about that sense of community in your space? So like, how do you establish, because ISE is, a lot of the work is sort of digital, geographically non-proximate. How do you guys establish community? What does that look like? What is your practical decision-making, community organizing processes? What do they look like today? Maybe as opposed to the dead period or the early period even?
The big difference between kind of the classical era of the ISC of the 80s into the early 2000s and right now is, as you said, that this shift to the online. The central program in the old days was this month-long in-person program called Ecology and Community that was hosted in Vermont, where people would come from literally all over the world for summers on end to do deep extended study. It also involved, because they had this land base, or rotated between a couple of them over the decades, it meant that a lot of ISE educational programming was, in addition to the social theory stuff, also focused on concrete hands-on skills like permaculture, renewable energy generation, sustainable construction, things of that nature that were, particularly when we started in the 1970s, extremely cutting edge, even just technologically speaking. That is all stuff that we don't really have the capacity to run at this stage, although I would love to change that. I think there are things that we can do and have been doing to build some more relational linkages between people in the online sphere, but honestly, I think the programming that we offer that does the most to actually cultivate community within the ISC is the in-person things that we do run. So every summer we run a week-long program called our Summer Intensive that's at a different site somewhere around North America. And that is by far the most impactful on its participants, the one that leaves people with some genuine lifelong relationships and that sort of anchors our community building in a way that's just not replicable in a digital space. There are things that we run that have a more relational dimension in the online space. So we, the last several years, have been running a structured mentorship program where participants are paired one-on-one with a mentor in the ISC, and then everyone who shares the same mentor in a given cycle form a cohort, which kind of functions as a longer term individualized study group. And that's been really valuable for being able to have some more sustained relationships between people that anchor their participation and that I know people continue to draw upon even after they rotate out of the program itself. Right now, we're also trying to reinitiate a practical dimension to our educational offerings in terms of community organizing training. So historically, although the ISC has been a space for incubating movement work, we've tried to stay squarely within an educational niche as a sort of offering to the wider movement rather than be an organizing vehicle in itself. But one new initiative that we just started in the past year is a training program for organizers through a model that we're calling the Neighbor Union. And it's kind of a base building approach that is centered around building relationships among neighbors through social, not politically charged gatherings, pop-ups in the park, things like that, with kind of the analysis that we need to reweave so much social fabric in an atomized landscape for anything resembling community self-governance to be possible. And so we did a regional cohort in Pacific Northwest last year. We're going to do another one starting this spring. There have been other kinds of training and political development of for community organizing purposes that we've run historically, but that's mostly looked like helping skill up people as well as helping or assisting different kinds of neighborhood-based community movements having a social ecology flair to their approach or their aspirations and horizons.
Yeah, and I like the idea of reweaving the social fabric and producing new ways of learning and relating with one another. Can you talk about how some of these practices or projects or programs are creating new or alternative conditions for thinking, learning, or relating outside of maybe traditional academic forms?
There's a number of different formats in which we're facilitating that. I think the mentorship program in particular is something that we've envisioned as something to help catalyze and reproduce our own processes of intellectual generation. We're attempting to use those to cultivate a space for people to step into the role of the next generation of instructors and thinkers and writers in this political tradition. And for many of the people involved, they are also movement organizers and activists, or particularly if like the generational cohort that's a part of this this era of ISE work are mostly coming from a more working class, precarious social position that I think makes it qualitatively different from the kind of idea thinking generation that you can find in mainstream academic journals and such. So what is in my view, the like key ingredient or the thing that makes the sort of thinking process that we cultivate or incubate different is that it sits in this intersection between actual movement activity and reflection upon that activity. So the people doing the teaching or even just like the facilitation of our discussions, the student pool that is most drawn to our offerings are people who are, for the most part, active militants in the radical movements of the day. And I think even though I believe that theoretical reflection and thinking really deeply on some of these questions is of the utmost importance for the future of our movements, for the rigor of what we have to put out into the world. I think the equivalent of that in other academic spaces is a sort of remove from the actual activity of social. And so I think part of our role that helps create that special sauce is to be a vehicle for those who are, let's say, more intellectually minded to find themselves in actual popular struggle, and then for those who are in the wider movement to kind of encourage, prompt, agitate them to take space to think more seriously about where we're coming from and where we're going. And I think it's that combination that's really essential to kind of the identity of what we're about and what differentiates it from university life.
That links up really nicely with kind of one of our central concerns here on the pod, which is essentially what is the future of Schole, of this, if we think about Schole as a kind of the root of scholar and of school, some kind of leisured study that doesn't have to be immediately productive and yet is presumed to somehow improve one's community, not just one's personal standing. I wonder if you could say a little more about what Schole, or maybe just study in the kind of, Marxist, post-Marxist tradition means to you and to ISE, and maybe, what are the tendencies within the organization in sort of developing different threads for that? Where's that going in the future? How do you hold space for Schole as an organization? And, what kinds of commitments to practice in the world interweave with then scholarly knowledge making? Like, I think you guys do some publications as well. You reify knowledge in more static forms sometimes. How do these things all fit together for ISE as an organization?
Well, to tackle the first part of that, Murray Bookchin believed very fervently in the political importance of the study group as a sort of cellular unit of social consciousness raising and political advancement of popular movements. And through his whole life was involved in different ways of these small discussion-based groups of people in part of the same kind of movement spheres. And he saw his role also as studying and resurrecting the role of comparable organizations or discussion spaces in the course of the French Revolution, the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, these kinds of upsurges that were able to secure their strategic victories through having proliferation of people who'd been wrestling with key questions over the preceding years. I don't think that necessarily came out of that process of his own movement activity with the perfect solved all the questions kind of model for how this is pursued. But I think for myself personally and for other people in the kind of social ecology sphere, taken a lot of inspiration concretely from traditions like especificismo in Latin American anarchism, from the party model in the Kurdish movement. And what I want to push people in the direction of for revolutionary oriented thought and intellectual engagement is the Cadre model of people who are part of a dedicated organization that really prioritizes collective political study to better understand the particulars of one's local terrain, one's local social context, rather than trying to import or copy and paste the political or organizing models from other places around the world that may bear no resemblance to where we are and live, and to, through that process of collective study, build an organizational container that can move together with theoretical and tactical unity out in the world, which is where we actually go and do the popular movement building and base building work that is the actual vehicle for transforming society and building self-governing communities. But I think it's really important for us to see if we're treating the time scale of this work on the order of decades rather than months, to have those kinds of communities of deep interpersonal trust and affinity in political terms, who we can return to rehash what challenges we're facing, and to maybe even have substantial changes in direction if our situation has changed in unpredictable ways, or what we thought would work has reached dead ends. I think that for the ISC, we're trying to position ourselves as a resource for a much more sprawling ecosystem of self-organized study groups and affinity organizations. And I don't think that the process of this kind of radical study needs to come through our doors, but having people throughout the movement have linkages to our work, or who have been able to do some deep study through our programming, turns them into the kind of leaders in movement as movement intellectuals who can kind of assemble those spaces for themselves. For example, one of my own mentees in our mentorship program came to a small number of ISC educational events and courses a couple years ago, and was just really inspired, and has, for the past, I think, 2 years, been running her own study group where she's the only person who, as far as I know, has ever attended an ISC anything of that group. But they've been learning a lot of stuff together, doing some original writing and thinking in ways that are really exciting. And I think that kind of approach is how we can also punch a little bit above our weight class of the people who come through our programs taking the initiative to kickstart their own little communities of political study and political action. There were multiple parts to that question. I know I didn't tackle all of them. Was there anything else you wanted me to?
Well, there was one last piece which was about I don't mean reifying in like the sort of bad commodity fetish way, but I just mean like making static or making perjuringly available knowledge gained. It seems like that's part of the ISC's remit, is sometimes publishing things, or has been. Is that an important part of your sense of the organization's future, or what does that mean for you guys?
I wish we would do more of that, actually. And this is my recurring broken record line to everyone who I work with in the mentorship program or in classes and stuff, is you all should be writing. And even if you don't have anywhere to put it, anything to do with it, having a practice that forces you to clarify your own thinking to yourself, and then become something that you can return to later to think about how your own ideas are in motion, is really important. Bookchin and others in the sort of prior phase or era of the ISC did write quite a lot, but as I've come to be more interpersonally enmeshed with a lot of these people who've been around for many more decades than I have, it's also become really clear that there's so much thought produced within the ISC, through the ISC, that was never recorded in an accessible way. And there's kind of an oral tradition of lots of even just arguments made through the history of social ecology that are transmitted in one fashion, but I think it's really important to have form, even just as a form of record keeping of the intellectual history of our movement, that can be captured in an essay here or a video recorded lecture there. I think that's also really important for this dissemination question. I think we were talking before about how individual people who come through our programming can then spiral outward and influence the intellectual trajectories of a number of other people. And if some of the key things that we're conveying to people only are transmitted in the context of an online seminar or an in-person gathering or what have you, I think there's an inability to stretch beyond that. Whereas things that are this is the most powerful thing about the written word, is that it can move so much faster, so much further than we can speak or be in conversation with each other. So the theory journal that we have is like a resurrection of something that was run in the late 90s, early 2000s, and have done a few contemporary issues of. That's only one piece of the puzzle, but I really do want to prioritize making that a more intentional vehicle for capturing some of what people are thinking in this moment, and also just to be a space of some more debate. I think lots of what's most generative about these kinds of spaces isn't our political affinity, but it's our disagreements, where we can really sink into some of the questions that we might breeze by or not take seriously enough if they aren't exposed by our own conflicts or disagreements. And I think the written sphere is a really important space for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and just clarifying what thinking is going on, I think there's a lot of different models for thinking and thinking through what thinking is right now, and as it continues to evolve. And both, I think, the university, outside the university, and sites of possibility for that thinking, I think, is super important. I want to know a little bit more about how you imagine the future of learning spaces, of knowledge-making spaces beyond the university. And are there any other spaces you take inspiration from or maybe hold as cautionary tale?
I think one of the most important dimensions to the future of learning is in the political education space, where organizations that have perhaps a more developed ideological foundation meet the much messier sphere of the public, of talking with people as workers or tenants or neighbors. I've encountered many different efforts to inject a educational dimension to those kinds of base building, organizing initiatives. And I think for the most part, American movements, at least during my lifetime, have done a pretty poor job of that. And I think the future of effective learning spaces of that kind, that bring an intellectual culture out into the street, is something that we're going to need to take some more conscious direction from movements elsewhere around the world. One thing that I'm excited about this spring, we have a Brazilian scholar working on a new course on the role of agrarian educational practice in the landless workers movement in Brazil, which is a project that he's directly involved with. There are comparable processes of bringing critical political thought into the culture of every day in radical movements in the Middle East, in Mexico, in Southeast Asia, that I think we have a lot to learn from. I would love and I guess this kind of answers the question of what sorts of spaces I take inspiration from. One in particular that's really stuck with me ever since I was able to visit it is in the state of Chiapas in Mexico, on the edges of San Cristobal de las Casas. There is an indigenous university of sorts that's aligned with the Zapatista movement called SEDESI, and they are basically a self-sustaining university for all manner of concrete practical skills. So like all the buildings on the campus have been built by students in the construction program who learn by doing on the site. All the food that is eaten on site is produced by the students in the agroecology programs. They run a cooking school that supplies the cafeteria and so on and so forth. But in addition to what's basically a trade school, woven throughout is the process of democratic political study among people of varying degrees of political consciousness. And I think this question of educational or scholarly space is related to bigger struggles over space and territory that shape the kinds of radical movement imagination and desire for more radical forms of democracy in this country. I think part of why we struggle here to carve out a space for ordinary people coming together in a commons to learn together or even just to discuss together is that such physical space does not really exist for us. So part of the inspiration I take from those kinds of movements like the Zapatistas or the MST is not just the practice or the pedagogy of doing learning together, but the kind of movement conditions that we need to win in order to be able to carry that out in a serious way. Cautionary tales, I can't think of any offhand, although I'm sure they'll come to mind afterwards. But I think in general, the future of learning beyond the university has to involve maybe some concentric circles of those people who really want to dedicate themselves to a life of learning and teaching, who see their vehicle for that as the movement itself being embedded in popular struggle, and then having something a little looser, more culturally diffuse, where the accepted norms and practices of our the spaces, our neighborhoods or our tenant councils or what have you, are designed to get people talking and thinking and asking each other hard questions, and maybe sometimes even reading difficult stuff together and trying to figure it out.
Just to expand on that, are there any thinkers or scholars, maybe older or contemporary, who you think our listeners should be reading right now? And how does your own collaborative work in the Institute for Social Ecology relate to and grow out of your own scholarship or your own experiences of Scole and communities across time?
There are so many people that I want folks to be reading. I think at least for people in radical movements in the United States, there are some key traditions that I think are under discussed, underread here, partly because they were not translated, or have yet to be translated, but partly because they're just kind of been on the edges of our consciousness. I think people, particularly those who think a lot about pedagogy and intellectual production, should engage with the anarchist education movement from Spain, mostly in the figure of Ferrer, who was a really important figure, individual in the Spanish anarchist movement. Many of those practices were generalized in the context of the Spanish Civil War and the Revolution, where the movement, in its struggle against clerical institutions, needed to define its own kind of educational space, given that the church had run most of the schools. And then there's a really important historical link between the Spanish anarchist movement and its defeat by the fascist forces in the Civil War, and the the anarchist movement of Latin America, often involving like direct individuals who fled Spain and ended up in Uruguay and Argentina, who were able to keep much of that intellectual pedagogical ethos alive. And so I really encourage people to engage with some of the thinking about organization and idea program generation that's come out of organizations like the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation, and some of its inspired offshoots in Brazil and the Southern Cone. There's a really extraordinary book that just came out a couple of years ago. Author's name escapes me, but it's called Anarchist Popular Power. By far the most detailed English language discussion of this movement in Uruguay. That I think has so much to contribute to our own thinking about doing teaching in movement context and the role or relationship between the mass and the, let's say, more politically developed core. I also, I think there's a lot of really valuable learning in a concrete sense for like the relationship between consciousness raising and mass movement building that we have to learn from Kurdish movement in Syria. Some really important recent books on that front have from Dilar Dirick and Aziza Aslan. I really encourage people to hunt down, and I can send some details along afterwards.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. I think that's giving me some reading too. I didn't know about the book about the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation. I wanted to ask, what have we not asked you about? What are we not sort of trying to learn from you here that if we understood better what ISE does and is about, we might have asked you? What matters here that we're missing maybe?
One of the, I think, really important parts of the intellectual culture of the ISE that, in my experience, sets it apart from a lot of comparable or parallel politically radical institutions of education is a focus on philosophy and the centrality of philosophical questions to bigger picture concerns of like the political future of humanity. For social ecology, that mostly revolves around ecological philosophy, which we approach from out of the dialectical tradition. But ultimately, I think why we spend a lot of time and energy wrestling with such things or trying to push other people who are developing themselves politically to do the same is that for us, questions of what kind of society we ought to have are interwoven with questions of what ought the relationship be between human beings and the rest of the living world, and how should we understand that relationship. And so, a lot of what we teach relates to things like political theory or, study of capitalism or alternative economic arrangements or the history of revolutionary movements. But we always try to approach things with a philosophical foundation that is kind of central to cultivating people in the social ecology tradition.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mason. This was really awesome. We're really grateful for your time and your work, not just with here today, but in the struggle to salvage a sense of Skole and really to invent and be part of something in the world that makes that more possible. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I had a good time talking with you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you again to Mason for joining us this week. Something that really stood out from our conversation was this idea of the Cadre Model, or people who are part of a dedicated organization that prioritizes collective political study to better understand the particulars of one's local terrain, one's local social context, rather than trying to copy and paste the political or organizing models from other places that bear no resemblance to where they live. And through that process of collective study, build an organizational container that can move together with theoretical and tactical unity out in the world. It deeply resonates with Murray Bookchin's idea of the study group as a sort of cellular unit of social consciousness raising and political advancement of popular movements. When we think about the special sauce of what creates a para-academic space for learning between, alongside, and outside the university, I think about the conditions that would enable a cadre coming together to keep ideas in motion at the intersection of popular struggle and reflection. And I think negotiating those constraints is the real work of para-academia. It's building a bridge between the messier sphere of the public and the deep philosophical questions to bigger picture concerns like the political future of humanity. For the ISE, this means engaging in actual movement activity and reflection upon that activity, working with a generational cohort of movement organizers from more working class, precarious social positions, and centralizing that work with philosophical questions like what kind of society we ought to have. And how is that interwoven with the relationship between human beings and the rest of the living world? And how should we understand that relationship? For us on the pod, I think this means capturing the collective intellectual work happening in between traditional university spaces under crises and reflecting on how this fosters a sense of scolae, of collective thinking and learning toward human flourishing. But I want to ask, what does it mean to build a bridge in other spaces? And how does this idea of para-academia allow those bridges to be built? And how do we continue building new bridges for a sense of scolae in real life? For opportunities to learn, to think, to struggle together. Tune in next week where we are joined with John Roff and Matt Keeter from the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy and FOPA. MSCP is an independent teaching and research organization established in 2002 by a group of mildly disaffected postgrad students from the University of Melbourne Philosophy Department. It was created in the spirit of resistance to the hidebound conventionality of modern-day university life, to the ongoing crisis of corporatist mentalities shaping funding systems, grant allocations, research schemes, and teaching and assessment regimes. We also talk about FOPA, or Festival of Para-Academia, that has emerged from the MSCP, and how they are developing collective equipment for para-academia by making the platforms, vehicles, and events to grow knowledgeable publics. We talk about how both these spaces open up new possibilities for scolae, for thinking and learning beyond institutional ends. Until then, for myself and Ira, thank you for listening.
Watching as the vortex spins below, you throw an insult to the volcano. Oh, my lord, is nothing sacred anymore. No.
Thank you to Devin Church for making music available from his album All That's Solid Melts Into Air. For a link to Devin Church's music and other key resources on today's episode, check out our show notes.